One of the big things for many years been trying to look at is educating people on esports. When I say people, I'm talking about brands and other people that don't actually or aren't aware so much of the ecosystem there. But also thank Barclays as well for their support. And they've been big supporters, not just with esports, but video games as well, and a lot of initiatives in the industry. So it's been really good. Before I jump in, I did notice one of the questions there, which I've had a bit of a think about, was why isn't esports potentially as strong in the UK as other countries? Why is the UK behind? There's so many different views on that. And one of the ones I'll just chuck in there as such, and it's not necessarily the answer, but if you go back many years, in the UK, consoles have been very strong, e.g. Xbox, PlayStation, Nintendo Wii have been very strong. So they haven't always been big in the esports arena. As you know, it's grown a lot more now. So yes, you can compete with, you know, PlayStation, Xbox, but going back, whilst other countries were very much a PC orientated environment. So especially the Scandinavian countries, if you see for population, they're very, very strong in esports and produce lots of fantastic teams. And what happened going back historically, the governments in a number of the countries actually provided support for young people to get PCs because they saw it's an opportunity for them to learn coding and develop a tech industry as such. So they encouraged them to get PCs. And so what do the kids do? They play esports. But I mean, you wouldn't have happened here maybe, or maybe it might now. But going back sometime, you know, the Prime Minister of Denmark and people like that have greeted the esports teams and embraced them as such. So I think there's a cultural thing, technology as such. So there's a lot of reasons, but it is hopefully changing and getting better. Just a little quick background. I've been in the video games industry for over 30 years. I know it doesn't look that long, but I was there when Pong was, you know, pretty popular. I have been with Nintendo for over 17 years. Before leaving them, I was in charge of the UK and Ireland for Nintendo, and I moved into esports with a company called Gfinity. Currently, I'm co-chair of the UK's esports subgroup with James Dean, who's the MD of ESL here in the UK, and I'm also on the board of the British, or advisory board of the British Esports Association. And currently, I am a co-founder of a company called Edge, which I'm not here for that. So I'm going to give you a quick overview and snapshot. It's going to be quick and it's going to be a snapshot because there is so much I could tell you about and that. But if you've got questions, obviously you can put them down and we'll try and answer some of them. I've taken the view that you know nothing to some extent. I'm sure there are people on this presentation that know quite a lot, and in some instances probably know more than me. But I wanted to give it just a bit of an overview and a taste for people coming from the brand area to introduce them to esports. So it's pretty, I'm going to say pretty simple. There's a lot of discussion in some respects about whether esports is a sport or not. We're not going to get into those arguments, but basically what we look at is it's competitive video gaming. In fact, if you look at some of the big publishers, Electronic Arts and Nintendo don't actually refer to esports. They refer to it as competitive gaming. And because the whole thing is, it doesn't necessarily mean, I think what they're looking at is that the concept of esports is potentially more of the professional side of things where people are competing for, when I say money and prizes, but it's generally a human versus human. Yeah, well, it is a competitive thing, very much like traditional sports where you compete. They can consist of amateur tournaments. There's a number of different grassroots organisations. When I say in the UK, there's university leagues. There's British Esports, which is for more grassroots. So there's an opportunity, and it's growing for more amateur people to get involved in tournaments, and then hopefully get in the pipeline and the funnel to move into a more professional gamers where they compete for prize money, product trophy, or just plain glory. We think of esports, it's a game of skill, very much, as I say, compared to other sports. In fact, the professionals, you know, they train many hours a day. As I think Patrick was mentioning before, they have dietitians, trainers, people to make sure that they're fit, not just mentally, but physically as well, because it can be quite draining. They're just like, as I say, professional sports or athletes in any other field. Whoop. Okay. So when we're talking about esports, what I wanted to just point out is that esports is really, I suppose, a bit of a subsystem of the whole gaming industry. It's one part of it. In comparison, though, a lot of people lump esports into one thing, but it's a little bit like comparing football to cricket. There are different games within esports. However, a lot of people that may follow one particular game will have some interest in maybe Counter-Strike, but they might not be so interested in FIFA. Just like someone's interest in rugby may not be interested in football, but it tends to be lumped in all together. Video games industry, as a lot of you probably would know, has just been growing continuously over the last few years, and they're expecting about 189 billion in sales. And esports is a small, when I say small part of it, a growing part of it. And there's many different, as I say, people involved. I'm not going to talk about all the publishers and all the different people that make games and have esports games, but more focus a little bit about some of the sort of teams and other areas which you might be hopefully of interest, and probably bring in a little bit about streaming, because it's a very strong part of the esports culture as such. Some of the leading teams, and I'm not going to go there, and thank goodness I had Excel down there and Fnatic, ESL, Gfinity. These are sort of teams. You've got other companies involved that we consider to be the broadcasters in this area, which is where the streaming comes into it. There are people like Twitch and Facebook and YouTube. If we look at the publishers who actually have the games that are played in there, I mean, you've got people like Activision, Blizzard, Electronic Arts, Riot Games, Epic Games. I mean, it's interesting, however, if you look at it with some of those companies, Riot Games is 100% owned by Tencent. Epic Games is 40% owned by Tencent. Supercell are owned 84% by Tencent. Even Ubisoft and Activision have about a 5% holding by Tencent. And then PUBG, which is a company that runs that or develops that, Bluehole has a Tencent of about 11.5%. So if you're looking at the big player in this industry, it's Tencent as such. However, I would have to say they're really quite hands-off and don't really, when I say interfere with any of the subsidiaries as such, and let them get on with it. So there's a lot of people in the ecosystem, a lot of big teams that are global, that have a following all around the world. If we look at the audiences, there's about 474 million people who watching esports, and it's growing year on year. I think there's been good growth in comparison to what we probably been experiencing in traditional sports. And in fact, having spoken to a number of traditional sports rights holders, whether it be football or F1, they have seen a decline in their audience numbers. It's because combination of things is the fact that their audiences or fans are aging, and young people aren't necessarily jumping into football or F1 or some of the other sports. But it's not just the fact of not following it, it's how they consume their media. So the traditional sports have been much more aligned in sort of mass broadcasts through, the Skies and BTs of the world and free to air, whilst esports has grown up, once I grown up with streaming. And that's probably one of the things that really kicked off esports, is when streaming became a lot more viable as far as with better broadband, etc., that you could start building a digital audience. No doubt there'll be, with the traditional sports and followers as such, there may be some more fallout from the Super League fiasco, because one of the big things, and I think it comes across all areas, including esports, is don't forget your fans. And in fact, that's one of the big things which is combination attractive for a brand in esports, is that the fans are, when I say easy to get to, but they can become very, very loyal. However, if you mess them around, they can also be a very negative or critics of when you do things wrong. And because it's digital, the voice can be amplified so much more globally, and they're very good at that. Just an example, League of Legends, which has been mentioned a couple of times, in 2020 had 91.9 million hours viewed on Twitch and YouTube. A lot of people compare these numbers to things like the NBA final or NFL finals, things like that, and say how much bigger it is. And the numbers are growing and are significant. Revenue in esports. As I said before, if you looked, I mentioned before with video games being about 189 million in revenue, and esports is about 1 million in revenue. It is a very, very small part of it, of that whole ecosystem. It's growing, and a big chunk of that revenue comes from sponsorship, which is where a lot of the brands are coming in, is sponsoring and brand placement, etc. Audiences are growing as well, growing 10%, 14% for revenues. And I'll go through a little bit more detail there. They're still quite small, I suppose, in comparison to other sports properties, but then taken in context, being part of the video game market, it's hard to sort of measure that. With esports, I think a lot of the publishers in the past have seen esports as a marketing opportunity to help build their brand and help sell their games. But it's grown much more than that now, that it's a standalone revenue stream for them, and it will continue to grow. As I mentioned before, the big chunk of the esports revenue is in the sponsorship side of things, and then there are companies will pay to get those rights to be able to stream it, because it does attract audiences. It's very fun. Well, I shouldn't say funny, but merchandising and tickets were a big chunk of that, and they're probably more merchandising, because I mean there hasn't been so many live events even in esports where ticket sales were there. But in the past, before we had the pandemic, there were very big events with lots of ticket sales. In fact, some very, very big ones that were sort of bigger than a lot of sporting events. One area I think that's going to show that we haven't actually seen so much, I was going to say in the West, is the growth of mobile gaming. And esports, mobile gaming esports in Asia is very, very big. In fact, it's probably in a lot of the countries the predominant factor. That's with PUBG Mobile and Garena Free Fire. A couple of games of mobile was really big in places like China and other areas. I did mention streaming, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk about it, because that's where a lot of the audiences for esports are placed. A lot of the teams will do streaming of the players practicing, because when they're practicing, viewers want to see them practice. They want to understand, they want to learn more about the players. They want to know the stories behind the teams, the players, where they've come from, how they've got where they are. Just like any other sporting heroes, they want to know about their players, and the platforms that they watch it on are things like Twitch, where they can watch it. So teams like their players streaming when they practice, because it also gives them opportunity to talk about their brands that are sponsoring them, talk about the game and the tournaments that are coming in. So there are some very, very good players who stream, I must say, who are good streamers, and but then others that aren't so good. So the ones that tend to be really successful, the ones that have that sort of personality, which teams are trying to educate. Some of the big names you hear in streaming were actually esports players, but they were probably, well, they probably beat me easily, but they weren't necessarily the top, but they had a very good rapport with their audience. So I think the other important thing is with this is the building of communities and virtual communities. A lot of people think that video games, and then conversely with esports, isn't a very social activity. In fact, that's totally wrong. It's a very much a social activity, and communities are really, really passionate about either their games or their teams. And so you have to really make sure you look after them and develop those communities, which can also become, as I say, very, very big advocates for their brands that support them. So really, really important. Just like, I suppose, in traditional sports teams, where they sort of construct the, various sort of with their fan engagement, etc. A lot of the esports teams, as I mentioned there, position themselves as lifestyle brands, because it's a combination of not just building their brand and getting the fans in, It's also income stream with the sort of they're doing, producing clothing. It's just like, I suppose, every year, or not every year, a number of times a season, where football clubs change their jersey tops and colours, and therefore another heap of sales are made to all the supporters. Very similar with esports teams, where their fans want to get the tops and buy merchandise. So it's a very much big thing to make it more of a statement there. If we're looking at streaming, there's a number of, I want to say, big players in this place, being, as I mentioned before, Twitch, YouTube. A lot of them spend a lot of money trying to buy into the space. Facebook gaming as well, in different areas, and as I say, in other parts of the world, there's other players that are really big, and especially, I mean, when you look at China, where some of the Western companies aren't allowed to operate. You've got companies like Douyu.com, which is they have about 163.6 million active users each month. A little bit smaller than them is Huya, and they have 140 million monthly active users. Huya is very similar, but Huya is owned 50.1% by Tencent. So those two companies in China have a much bigger audience than the whole of some of the other organizations around the world. I mean, it's a huge market, and it's a real growth. Part of the whole streaming thing, one of the things I just wanted to share, because I'll be winding up very quickly. Hopefully I've probably spoken too quickly. But one of the things I want to share is about, if you do look to get into esports or streaming, is about being authentic. You've got to talk in the language. You've got to be able to relate to the fans. And there's an interesting story. I'm going to show you a short clip in a moment, and hopefully the clips work, because sometimes with streaming it might be a little bit jagged. But going back some time ago, Mercedes decided they wanted to get into esports, and a friend of mine actually was a Mercedes ambassador, and he met some young esports players at a conference, and he came back to me and said, David, there's these young guys about 18 or 20, and they do something called esports. What's that all about? He's a traditional sports person. And he explained to me the reason Mercedes wanted that is because they saw them as the audience of the future. And the fact that in the future, they may not be selling cars, but they may be selling time, where people don't buy a car, they just buy time, because driverless cars, etc., will be here sooner than we think. And who's the first people that are going to adopt that type of new technology is the younger audiences, and very much in this technology area, so gamers. So Mercedes got involved in esports very early on, and they got involved in a very traditional manner. They basically almost transposed ads they did to the normal audience into this new audience, and it was starting to get canned. It was, they're going, don't come to us and talk to, about cars and this, that, and the other. You're not with it and all this. And one of the teams, I was sponsoring a tournament, and all the teams got given Mercedes to drive. One of the teams at the end of the tournament came out to the car park and found that the car had been clamped. And they took pictures and posted them. And the audience started, the followers started really enjoying that and putting up a lot more sort of comments. Mercedes were, no, you can't do that, can't do that. Our cars don't get clamped. It's not good for the brand to be clamped. And they then relented. The ESL, I think at the time, said, look, you've got to let this go. If you try and stop this, you'll create bad vibes. So they let it go, and it turned positive. And their brand is really well, when I say respected, and they've been there for a while. You can't just come in and start spending money and expect to get the response. You've got to be there longer term, because, as I say, the fans are really conscious of that. I'm going to show you a short clip now, Mercedes, how they've embraced esports, which I think is a really good indication.
As you get older, life becomes all about following a few simple rules. Dress proper. Get a real job. Spend time with family. Dance to the beat of your own drum. Work hard. Get married. Move to the suburbs. Start a family.
There's some, you've really got to make sure you talk their language and relate to them. There's some really good other examples, I think, of brands that have got involved. DHL, a freight company in esports, but they've done some really good activations as well. One of the things I think to look at, which if you looked at some of these videos, it has, I suppose, esports a bit of a reputation of being quite male dominated. That is changing very rapidly because it's one of the only sports or competitions where it doesn't matter whether you're male, female, whether you have a disability, shape, size, where you're from, you can compete on a level playing field. And there's a lot more, there's a number of mixed teams. There's a lot of girls and women involved in management, marketing, team managers, organizing and playing. So it is a really positive changing space. So make sure you talk their language. And if you do have any questions, I'm going to have a quick look at the Q&A. Sam, I've finished. Stop sharing.
David, that's an excellent summary. Thank you very much for doing that. Feel free to have a look at some of the Q&A and answer some of those questions as we go. We're going to move on now, and that same goes for all our panelists. They'll be looking at the Q&A and getting some answers in there as we go. So thank you very much, David, for that top line summary. We will be sharing the slides afterwards so that everyone can have a look at it. And now we're going to move on to our panel. So I'm going to be joined by Ollie and Stephen. Looks like everyone's there. That's wonderful. Thank you. Changing the whole order today. This is the beautiful on the move way that we're going to do it. Stephen, I'm going to hand over to you first. Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, my name is Stephen Hutchins. I'm the marketing director at Hi-Res Studios. We're a video games publisher, developer, esports runner, all the fun stuff that's happening out there basically with our games, all in the competitive online multiplayer space. And our main titles are Smite, Paladins, Rogue Company, and Realm Royale.
Wonderful. And you were kindly enough to prompt me into getting these events together. So thank you for that. No, I appreciate it.
Thank you very much for organising. They've been great. So
well, I always do as I'm told. I mean, that's the key. Ollie, over to you now. Tell us a little bit about yourself and London United.
Thanks, Sam. Good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to be here. Can't see you, but I've seen as a healthy attendance. I'm Ollie. I'm founder, chief exec of London United. Actually, a little bit like Patrick, came into esports from a traditional sports background, having been at the Premier League and F1. And I run London United as an esports organisation that is promoting healthy lifestyle and addressing social issues using the medium of gaming and esports. So we have grassroots gamers, we have content creators, and we run campaigns to address social issues.
That's a lot to take in. We'll come back to that in a second and really drill down into that. But that's a fascinating setup. I'll be interested to hear, sort of the motivations behind that and how it's gone. We can't really talk about, business progression and meeting brands and creating opportunities without looking at what's happened in the last just over a year now. Stephen, how's the business been affected in the last sort of 13 or 14 months, if at all?
It's been a busy year, to put it mildly. Ultimately, we've gone from having what was a really strong content pipeline, both on the game side and the esports side, and just seen the last year really amplify what we already had in the works. We've seen big changes, though, in that sense as well. The obvious one being when we've done things like our live events, we've not been able to bring not only an audience to the experience, but also have to have the players playing from home. But that in some ways has also helped us bring new opportunities for the brands to the forefront as well. So being able to do more deeper engagements on the broadcast side, figure out new ways to integrate stuff on the technology side within the games to really help bring that full experience across for everyone who's getting involved with the esports side of things.
Well, I'm pleased to hear it's not been hampered anyway. We've seen some amazing stats for the video game industry in the last 13 or 14 months anyway, with more consumer engagement and more online participation, naturally, as people are looking for that form of entertainment. And Oliver, from your perspective, how have things been going?
Well, it was interesting because we set up in 2019 with a model to host physical events to find grassroots gamers. And the whole model was, you come to our events, you try out, and we'll sign you, nurture, develop, educate you as a grassroots gamer on a path to pro. And we held events addressing social issues in tandem, for example, Grime Against Knives at Lewisham Shopping Centre. And then suddenly when a pandemic sets in, you've got to turn your business model on its head. So we just pivoted to online and started to address the issues through FIFA and loneliness and nutrition and League of Legends and anti-racism through NBA 2K and FIFA and so on. So it was a very busy year, but I think we adapted quite well. I think things like production are a different beast when you're running it remotely to having everybody in one room. But I think like the nature of the industry, we've all got used to it. You heard Patrick earlier talking about how the LEC adapted. So I think we've all just become quite accustomed and quite interested to see when we come up the other end, what we revert back to, whether we go to a hybrid or, you know, we go back to physical completely or online. I think it's going to be a hybrid for most people.
Nothing like having a business model that gets totally shook up. But you've been, Oliver, some amazing announcements coming out from you in the past year, and some stuff with Rio Ferdinand that came out, what, last week, maybe a week before?
Last week.
Last week. I mean, just amazing that. Let's talk about the, you know, we're trying to talk about the engagement opportunities for brands and how you can work with them. How have you found working with brands, Oliver, and maybe some examples to share with us?
Well, I think, and I go back to Patrick's point about education, I think the esports and in fact the gaming sector is quite convoluted. There are so many entry points, whether it's with the publishers, whether it's in game, whether it's with the platforms, the tournament providers, it could be teams, organizations. It is quite complicated, and for brands that know they want to get into esports but don't quite know what they want to do, it can be overwhelming. So again, you know, through my relationships, we work out like who we think is relevant and wants to target the audience that we are engaging with. But our offering is slightly different. We are not Excel. We are not Fnatic. We are a lower tier organization that is addressing social issues. That is our USP. We're not a performance team. Yes, we have now got a Valorant team and we want to be successful, similar entry to Excel. But that's about brand visibility for us. And that's also about providing inventory to the brands. So when we look at the brands, we say, look, we have these offerings. We have gamers, we have the grassroots gamers, we have the female content creators, we have a TikToker who's interested in fitness, and we have the campaigns. Now, we know what you do, but no, there's no one better to tell us what you want to do. So let's have an open discussion. We have a lot of inventory. We're broadcasting on Twitch. Our last stream with Yacht, which I'll come to in a second, had 150,000 unique viewers. So there is engagement, the content is interesting, but you almost have to tell us a little bit about what you're trying to achieve, because it has to be authentic, as David said. You have to be savvy, you've got to do a bit of research. With Yacht, who came in, so we did a Mayor of London championships in various boroughs in December, and Yacht, who are owned by General Mills, own Häagen-Dazs, came in as a sponsor, but they had never done anything in esports before. So it was so for us, it's almost like come and dip your toes in and see if it works, or let's see if we can tweak it going forward. And that's really the way we work with brands. We have our targets. Yeah, we're never going to do something with betting and gambling for what we stand for at the moment. But, you know, from a fitness perspective, and, you know, the non-endemic brands, there are plenty out there looking to enter this space. They just need a little bit of finessing. They need to understand what are the activation points. Some of them have never even utilized Twitch. Some of them don't understand why people are watching people playing on Twitch. I say, well, you go and watch someone play football, don't you? So it's not too dissimilar. But once you start talking about it and you explain how the interaction and engagement works and you show them the numbers, they realize it's a space they got to play. So it's just a case of what works for them.
Yeah, it's interesting, the approach to make sure that the brands are genuine and actually to focus on brands that you think represent what you want to represent as a company, to try and get that balance right. Stephen, your games are slightly different in that respect. In terms of approaching brands and integrating them, how have you found that process in the past?
Yeah, so I mean, actually some of it's very similar to what Ollie's talking about just then as well. It's about coming across in an authentic way for that brand and figuring out which is the right angle to approach us and our audience with. Our benefit is that as a publisher and developer and broadcaster, we can offer the full end-to-end experience, from be that on the esports event itself, being the sort of title sponsor to that, or having your brand invested in that. You could be in the actual game itself. You can have your character or mascot of your company turned into something within the game, for example. You could be a part of the teams, and the big change that we have there this year is that we now fully own the team structure and the league structure in a way that we've changed quite dramatically to our previous years. But this gives you as a brand many different aspects of how you can reach our audience, and also gives you more touch points throughout the week than you would have, say, on a traditional sport where you're maybe just there for the the weekly football match, it can now be a daily, a recurring message that's in front of the player or in front of the viewer in many different ways. As mentioned on the team side, that's really quite different for us this year, where we now have full ownership of the teams and how the players are represented within that. We also get the benefit there of being able to pay them a higher salary off the back of it and giving them sponsorship opportunities. So if you want to be involved at that player level, again, there's another different angle for you to approach as a brand. But it really comes down to that point Ollie was raising a minute ago of like, what's the authentic way? What's the right way for you to bring that message across that you're looking to present to your audience as well, or as even to our audience with your particular message?
And is that a difficult thing to identify, that authentic message? With so many options available, you talk about the games, the players, there's so much content. How do you sort of match those things? Is there a process for that?
It's an open discussion, ultimately. You've got to sort of approach it from each brand's own perspective in terms of what they're trying to figure out for their audience. We heard David talking about the likes of Mercedes there a minute ago. They're going to have a very different type of set of goals than a smaller local brand is. And so it's going to be an open discussion with them just to figure out what makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, that's also fine to come up as well. But ultimately, you're generally going to find a way that's authentic and feels natural to present, be that in the game, in the esports broadcast side of things. Otherwise, you're not going to want to put it out there because it's just not going to resonate with the audience when they see it.
And we talk about, thank you for that, Steve. We talk about resonating, Ollie, and you've got this social issues approach, which is fascinating. Do you think that opens up more opportunities for brand engagement, or are you making it more difficult for yourself, more complicated for yourself? So that not matter to you. You've got your principles, you're sticking to them. If the brands want to work for it, then that's fine. I mean, how do you see that working out?
I think honestly it's a bit of both, because sometimes you can be viewed as a CSR opportunity or a charity, and you have to, we're not a social enterprise. We're actually a business that cares about these issues and is using these issues to, build out a monetizable audience, quite frankly, one that's engaged, one that brands want to engage with. But there is a challenge, because you go through the door of a brand and immediately say, oh, we need to speak to our CSR person. No, actually, you've got to speak to us. It's about esports. There is a purpose angle to it, which actually should make it even more interesting for you. So that's what we try and do. We try and flip it on its head.
That's interesting. So, where is the approach into brands to have these conversations? So it might be on the CSR side, it might be on the marketing side. From your experience, Stephen, do brands now have a designated person that looks after this, or is it still something that gets passed around a little bit? Or are they all trying to get involved? I mean, how does that play out?
It really varies by the size of the company, and
right.
Also where they've come from in terms of their heritage. If you're approaching a bigger traditional company, they'll often have one person who's a big esports fan, or they have one particular game that they're a fan of, and that'll be their angle to try and pitch that within the organization. But other organizations will come from a more like youth-oriented focused area, and they'll therefore know a little bit more about the space and therefore bring a bit of experience to it as well. And the discussion will just unfold in a very different way with the type of partner you're talking with then as well. It's like what makes sense from their perspective in terms of what they know already, what additional knowledge can you bring to the table, and how can you help create that really sort of win-win situation where everyone's understanding that they're going to get a great partnership out of it. And that's something we're looking for as well. It's like we want to make sure a partner feels comfortable with us when they're talking to us, and that they know they're going to get a good result out of their campaign or their integration. We don't want them to be getting nervous that they're getting taken for a ride, because that's also happened to some companies in the past. There's been some bad examples of that. We want to make sure that we're not that. We want to make sure we're giving whoever's involved with us a great experience, and they want to then come back for another season or another integration at some point in the future.
That's a really positive message. And we're not going to go down the rabbit hole of looking at bad cases. Ollie, you've just announced your Rio Ferdinand partnership. What's that looking like? What's the objectives behind that?
Yeah, so on the 30th of May, we're going to be hosting another United Against Racism stream, this time with Rio and his foundation. It's about promoting diversity, but it's also about empowering young people in the UK. We're going to be looking at how society is handling equality, how has society moved on since George Floyd a year on, with young people having made a film. We'll be bringing in, darts player Devin Peterson, who grew up in South Africa, Miles Stevenson from Raksu, a whole host of other celebs to play in a FIFA Pro-Am. And the whole idea is around interspersing the gaming content with the educational messaging. So it's a platform that, you know, has got potential to get huge reach, as you know, with Twitch, which maybe the foundation hasn't utilized in the past. And we've seen when we've worked with other charities, a very good platform for raising awareness. Not always so great at raising money, but actually just from an awareness perspective for that charity and brand to be in and around Twitch and being able to tell people what they do and putting in video content to showcase that, you know, we worked with Street League, they brought out their participants to our event. It's just a very good opportunity to work with a great partner like Rio Ferdinand Foundation. So that's happening on the 30th of May.
That's amazing. That's really positive. We'll keep an eye out for that. And Stephen, final word from you. What should we be looking out for high-res in the next few months?
So we've just this last weekend started season 8 of Smite's Pro League, which is a great success. We've seen around 20,000 concurrent viewers on that steadily throughout the weekend, which is really solid. And like I mentioned earlier, we've got this new league format, this new team ownership structure. Really looking forward to just growing that, building out these brands for the teams, building out their opportunities. And also with our new title sponsor, Alienware, bringing them the great opportunities and showing what we can do across the many different sides of the business that we can offer them. So yeah, very exciting set of partnerships to come. A few more things to announce this year as well, which are very exciting, but unfortunately can't quite share this just yet. But it's going to be
that's fine.
We're
not, yeah, that's great. And thank you very much. You know, busy schedules. Really appreciate you giving your time up today. Thanks very much to Ollie and to Stephen.
Thanks, Sam.
Right, now going to be joined by Matthew. There we go, Matthew, let's bring you forward.
I can speak, I can't talk yet. I can't see yet, no video. There we go.
It's all right, you get your little prompt, there we go. So Matthew, I've moved you down the schedule.
I know.
Building you up to a big finale. You know, really, to start with, this event wouldn't happen without Barclays' support of UK events, and particularly around esports. So thank you for making this happen today. Want to hear a little bit about your engagement and how you've worked with esports. I'll just hand over to you and then come and ask you some questions later on.
Okay, no problem. Awesome. So, hi everybody, I'm Matt. I'm the esports lead at Barclays Games and Esports, and I look after esports really for the whole of the Barclays group across the pieces. So I think a little bit of a background, and the question that we got asked at the very start was, Barclays? Why Barclays? Who are Barclays here? And we knew it going into this that we're a very non-endemic brand. Especially in the esports space, and I think David mentioned earlier, we have been doing supporting in the game space as well. And traditionally, we have done a lot of support for both kind of the creative industries and the traditional sports. So hopefully most people would know that we have a kind of a long affinity with traditional sports, including kind of the Premier League that we were the title sponsor for a long time. We did ATP tennis, sailing, etc. And when we went to look into the esports space, we want to look about how can we engage but contribute as a non-endemic brand, as a financial institute. How can we be part of this ecosystem in a way that kind of brings something back? We didn't want to come in and be a brand that kind of slapped a label on something there, done. Esports fans will love us. So with our activations, we've kind of really looked at focusing on grassroots. So what is this? What is the start, and how can we grow the UK? And I think that's something that at the very start of the talk Patrick talked about is that the UK being behind the curve. What can we do to contribute to that, to bring the UK up to where it is in terms of games consumption? Because it's one of the top 6, top 5, depending on which stats you go on, consumers of games in the world. What was last time I checked, but nowhere near that from an esports perspective. So we've done this in a kind of number of ways, and I'll come on to that in a little bit. But first of all, kind of what as a brand, what is our key objectives in the space? So we don't have a consumer-facing product, which a lot of brands are in the space for. So it's really an idea to understand the sector from a business perspective. What does the sector need? What does the sector do? Secondly, understand the audience. So I think, again, Patrick and I think other people have said on the webinar so far is that there's a highly engaged, motivated kind of group of individuals that are the esports fan, but they can't be reached through traditional media. So they've got their ad blockers turned off. They don't watch linear TV. So how do you engage with that fan? And also that is becoming more and more apparent as that the Gen Z, Gen Alpha come up, is how do you engage with those people? And then lastly, obviously, I talked about understanding the sector. It's about learning from the sector. We didn't want to come in as a brand into the space and say, this is what we think you should do. We kind of wanted to come into the space and learn from it, both from the fans and from the businesses in the esports space. So we've had three activations so far in esports as a brand. Our first activation was we were the headline sponsor for the UKLC Summer Split 2020. So this was a time when things were pivoting. It was organised at the start of COVID, and it was a time when there wasn't much else for people to do and see, and we want to kind of support something that can continue to grow, something to carry on. So headline sponsors, working with DreamHack on that split and supporting UK. And yes, these are semi-pro teams, but with the creation of the NLC, they're still kind of on the cusp of that grassroots kind of, it's the pinnacle of UK, but it's still on that cusp. So we did some really great stuff with them, with the highlights and engaging with the community, and we got some really good feedback from the community of having us as a brand in the space. Our second and our current ongoing activation is we're partnered with the National Student Esports, NSE. So one of the two kind of major collegiate esports organisations in the UK. And with them, we are a sponsor of their British University Esports Championships, BUIC. As well as we've done some other activations and activity with them. Why we chose NSE and the students is, I think I put it in answer to one of the questions about why the UK is behind the curve. As a brand, we wanted to see kind of how the UK market would respond and where the UK is. And with NSE and with the student space, it's quite a defined demographic in the UK. Also, the NSE are kind of looking at esports not just from a TO, people playing esports, but they're also looking at it from a perspective of it's a catalyst for growth for the individuals. So kind of encouraging people to maximize on their activity in esports to grow their future potential. So there's a number of ways they've done this. There's a future gen program, which is about kind of developing the next kind of esports professionals, which I was lucky enough to sit on the judging panel for this year's section, as well as just looking at making people aware that what they're doing in esports is viable from it's worthwhile. It has a lot of transferable skills. So there's been, I've spoken to students before who early on were ashamed to put that they were in an esports society on their CV. Whereas there is so much that they are giving and offering from that. They're learning budgeting, they're learning management, they're learning people skills, they're learning teamwork, they're learning marketing. There's so many positives from the esports society. So trying to move away from that stigma is another piece. And then the second activation that we did with NSE was what we called the Games Innovation Challenge. And this is where we kind of wanted to kind of bring the two worlds that we work in together. So it was a challenge, kind of like a games jam for students to create a competitive game. So creating a game that could potentially be an esport over a 8 to 9 week period. And we had again, this was announced in quite a short period over this, it ended in, I want to say March or April. I should know those figures, but I don't have them on me right now. But we had over 20 teams from universities across the country submit projects, and the judging panel was kind of blown away by the top 3 that we had through, and the rest of the entrants. So again, getting people to think about that esports isn't just about those headline flashy figures as the pro gamer. It's about more than that. It's you can go into esports through a development route and all those other pieces. And then lastly, the one that probably makes makes the most sense, and people will probably expect us to be there, which actually our most recent activation brand partnership is the EPL, the E-Premier League, through the FA, where we were a sponsor on their activity, which got great traction. So yeah, all in all, that's kind of why we're here and what we're gaining from it. Any questions?
Matthew, thank you very much for your engagement. I'm quite interested. What was the reaction from people in the games industry when Barclays announced that they were, going to get involved and start doing some more general activities? What kind of response did you get?
So when we first, as a team, kind of started exploring this space, and we came to the likes of, I think, yourselves at Gamescom, and a lot of the questions were, Barclays, the bank? So there's been kind of a traditional, financial institutions have not necessarily been as turned on in this space as other brands. I think part of it is because of the consumer perspective. We haven't got a set product or a set activity to market to somebody, and most of the marketing and the brand kind of partnerships in the space tends to be around a specific thing. So if we go based on what people have already talked about, if you talk about Excel, and Patrick was talking about the low latency broadband, there's a set connection there. It's more ethereal, kind of the connection. But we want to be here, and we're a brand that supports the creative industries, and we support sport. That's quite hard to say. To the point where it makes sense for us to be in that space. And I think something that we're looking at in ways that we can help, not just from those perspectives, but also what can we offer as a brand in the space. So we started looking at things like financial literacy in the space. So you've got a lot of, again, from an esports professional perspective, you've got a lot of young people potentially earning considerably less amounts of money at a young age. So how is that financially stable and financially sustainable? So a lot of the teams are focusing on their mental well-being, their physical well-being. Again, Patrick talked about Fabio's regimes of tracking sleep and things, but financial well-being is something else that should be considered, because that is only going to be helpful to the entire industry, because it's going to help it grow and be sustainable. So you're not going to have those horror stories of people burning out and then having money. It creates a next steps, which I think is good. I think that's also good for the UK ecosystem, especially because you can get people bought into it, not just the enthusiasts, but you can get the parents bought in. If the parents kind of see that this is actually a viable future, I think that's also why we're doing this, the NSC pieces. It's about esports it's growing, it's sustainable, and it is a career option in multiple ways, and that's hopefully we can be helpful on that front.
Yeah, it's interesting. It would be too easy for things like the video game industry just to welcome all brands. Anyone that wants to be involved, we'd love to have them involved. But it's really great to hear that you're doing it using some of that sort of positive leverage and the positive impact you can have. And I'm delighted to say that we've seen majority of that coming into the esports scene so far. Some real valuable brands coming in that are adding significant value. We're dealing with young people here. It's a big challenge. You talk about the sort of the university esports scene. There's been a couple of questions today from people about looking even younger age than that. Do you have any guidance if you're, I don't know, not at university yet, maybe still at school, and you're interested in perhaps looking at this career? What are the kind of routes that you can get into esports on that sort of grassroots level?
It's an interesting one. And I think it's something that there is focus on. There are, like David Yarnton mentioned, there are British Esports Association who do work at that level. There's Digital Schoolhouse. I thought got to plug that as well. That do pieces, and I think it's a very good thing. And I think that also not only encouraging kind of looking at esports at a younger age is not only good for the esports community, but it's also good for things like diversity and inclusion. So I think that if you look at kind of the divide between boys and girls from a kind of a traditional sports perspective, that happens in school time. You know, that's when they do PE and sports together. Up to a certain point, suddenly they're divided up, and then it's not right to play together, even though they're fine until there. I think you could have a very similar piece in the digital space. So creating that getting that impact early, I think would be very powerful. In terms of routes, obviously there's two things I've mentioned. There's, again, responsibly, there's great communities online. Obviously you hear a lot of horror stories, and I think as parents you need to make sure you are managing your children's online activity, but at the same time there are some great spaces there, as long as you find the right ones and you are aware. And I know that, again, Yuki are running some great activities around that, about, like, I think, is it Know Your Game or something like that, or Know Your something. So be understanding as a parent or as an adult, understanding what your children are being involved with, but then doing that responsibly, you create great connections and next steps. And then there's platforms, again, for the kind of the more the old, maybe pre-university but older, kind of 16 plus. There are kind of platforms where you can start competing and finding kind of players to compete with. So and
of course, it's not just for players. You know, the industry needs shoutcasters, so commentators. We need technical people to deliver the programs. We need physiotherapists. We need team managers. You need all different aspects. There's so many jobs involved in esports, and this is a really fascinating way. I think it's something that perhaps is a little bit unseen out there. As people look at it, they think just the professional players making lots of money. It's not like that at all. There's a substantial industry out there with a lot of job occupation opportunities. You know, digital literacy is the most important thing here. How can we get our young people thinking digitally?
Yeah.
And esports is a sector that will benefit from that in the future. What do we get, without revealing too many secrets, what do you think we're going to see from Barclays around the esports scene, perhaps in the next couple of years? Where do you think you're going to be moving or going?
Oh, that's a hard one to answer without revealing any secrets.
I've not prepared you for it either. Sorry, I'm just dropping it straight on top there.
I think that we've set out a route to continue down this route of kind of grassroots and activations that matter, that have a purpose. What I'd love to see, I'm not saying this, so let's put on what I'd love to see us do in the next kind of few years is something that capitalizes on our work in gender diversity in traditional sports, obviously with our Women's Super League, it's the Barclays Women's Super League in the FA. I'd love for us to kind of be able to reflect that in the esports space. I'm trying to work on something, but no guarantee, but that's what I'd love to do. It's kind of a passion project for me. And then just continue this work and see where we can take it. And again, my dream is for us to become an endemic brand, to be a brand that people will, like we are kind of, say, traditional sports and football especially, there's an association there. So I'd love for us to get to that point. That would be fantastic.
Well, long may it continue. You've been an invaluable supporter of the esports scene so far. You've picked your areas that you want to work in, done an amazing job. Please continue to do so. And you know, thank you once again for your support on this event today. I'll be sharing. I'm going to turn your camera off now. We're going to be sending these slides out to all of the attendees today, and also a link to the video files of all of the talks. So really appreciate all of our attendees joining us today, and particular thanks to all of our speakers, David, Patrick, Matthew, Stephen, and Oliver. Really appreciate you giving up your time today and helping us. And for our attendees, we will be sending follow-up details to you so that you have all of that details. Our next eSport event will be just over a month's time. We're going to be focusing on how games developers can actually create eSport content. So we'll be having some developers sharing their experiences, and then also some eSport event organizers telling us the kind of content that the consumers actually want to get access to and how you can make it an authentic product. If you want to sign up for other Yuki events, go to yuki.org.uk, visit our events section. There'll be details of all of the events that we run there. They're pretty much all free. Come along, sign up, and be part of the process. But thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks again for the speakers. Have a good evening.